My name is David Merrill. This is a lecture on First Principles of Instruction. As an introduction, my major in secondary education was a very frustrating experience. I can only recall one or two lectures that dealt with effective instruction. I had a wonderful time as an unconventional student teacher. However, I caused great consternation from my principal and was advised that a career in public education would probably not work for me. As I expressed frustration to one of my professors and told him that I thought maybe I ought to pursue a different career, he challenged me by saying, "You could do that, or you could realize there were a lot of problems in education and perhaps you could help solve them." He suggested that I pursue a PhD. Not being one to walk away from a challenge, I picked up the gauntlet and decided to go after my doctorate. My first year graduate study was very difficult. Not only was there a tremendous amount of work, but it seemed there were way too many contradictions. The psychological theories that I was studying challenged my most basic beliefs. There were all kinds of contending systems, each claiming to explain learning. I spent hours trying to explain the concept green using SR or stimulus response bonds. I found myself in the basement of the psychology building feeding rats. Why was I feeding rats when I really wanted to teach people? I was about ready to abandon my graduate career and pursue a real job. About this time, B.F. Skinner visited our campus. Like my fellow classmates, I went to hear the great man. I don't remember many details of his lecture, but in a response to the question and answer period, he made a comment that changed my life. "What I've tried to do," said Skinner, "is to make as few assumptions as I possibly can and see how much human learning I can explain with only those assumptions." He went on to defend his theory and the point he'd made in his speech. I stopped listening before he ended his explanation. Good grief, I thought. A psychological theory is merely a logical system that tries to explain what we observe in the real world. But the theory itself is not the real world. But like mathematics and science, it's merely a way to try to understand the real world. Behaviorism is merely one psychological logical system that is tested against reality to see how much of a match can be found. There are many different psychological theories and systems. Each must be tested against reality to see how closely it fits. Some fit well, some don't fit very well at all. But none of them are really the real world. I returned to my studies with renewed enthusiasm. Later in my graduate career, I had an additional insight. We were studying learning and some instructional theories. It was apparent to me that while learning theories tended to explain how persons acquire and store knowledge, they have very little to say about how an instructor should structure and sequence knowledge for effective learning. It occurred to me that one could build a logical system, that is, a theory about instruction. Over the next several decades, what followed were component display theory and more recently first principles of instruction. As I will briefly explain in this lecture, first principle of instruction is my attempt to build a logical theoretical system about instructional design using only a few fundamental components and combining them into propositions about instructional strategies and into theoretical models. I hope that you enjoy this presentation on first principles of instruction. I went to graduate school to learn how to recognize effective instruction and how to design effective instruction. As my career developed, I formalized my research interest with one question: how do we identify or design effective, efficient, and engaging instruction? I've spent my professional career pursuing an answer to this question. In the last few years, e-learning has become the latest technological advance in promoting instruction. Some suggest that the E stood for electronic learning. But merely delivering instruction using technology does not make it effective. I felt that the E should reflect whether the instruction worked, not just how it was delivered. I coined the term E to the third power instruction, or merely E3 instruction. First principles of instruction is an attempt to develop a theory and a design model that promotes E3 instruction. That is, instruction that promotes effective, efficient, and engaging learning. First principles of instruction consists of first a foundation of instructional design theory. If we have terminology and propositions about what makes instruction effective, efficient, and engaging, then we ought to be able to use this terminology to describe existing instruction and use the resulting instructional strategy propositions to evaluate whether the existing instruction really promotes E3 learning. If we are able to identify instructional strategies that really work to promote learning, then we can build on this foundation to develop a model for designing E3 instruction. The second part of first principles of instruction is what I call the pebble in the pond model for instructional design. This approach to instructional design helps ensure that the resulting instruction will promote E3 learning outcomes. In this lecture, I will briefly review the instructional design theory underlying first principles of instruction, but I will concentrate this presentation on a description and illustration of the pebble in the pond model for instructional design.
On this slide, I will provide a very brief overview of the instructional design theory that is the foundation for first principles of instruction. Theory consists of three components: a set of terms that identify important concepts that comprise the theory, a set of propositions that combine these concepts or terms into if-then statements, and models that combine these propositions into a coherent whole. Instruction consists of two primary components: what to teach, or content, and how to engage the learner with the content, or interaction. Content and interaction can be combined into if-then propositions that then become the prescriptions or instructional strategies for teaching different kinds of content. First principles of instruction identifies 5 kinds of component skills that comprise much of the content to be taught. These are information about, part of, kind of, how to, and what happens. These categories are appropriate for most subject matter areas and are independent of the specific content of the different areas. Most of the skills in almost all subject matter areas can be described using these 5 categories of component skill. Content can be represented at 2 levels: an information level and a portrayal level. Information is general and applies to many different situations. Portrayals, or examples, are specific and apply to a particular object or situation. Both levels of representation are necessary for effective and efficient learning to occur. Too much instruction is information-rich, but example-poor. That is, we provide lots of information that applies to a wide range of situations, but we fail to provide sufficient specific illustrations of the ideas presented by the information. Chapter 3 of my book, First Principles of Instruction, elaborates and illustrates these 5 types of component skill. Learners can interact with content in 4 different interaction modes: tell, show, ask, and do. Tell presents information to the student. Information can be presented in many ways: speech, text, graphics, animation, and video. Show demonstrates portrayals or specific examples of the information. Portrayals can also be demonstrated in many ways: auditory, text, graphics, animation, and video. The interaction mode ask requires the learner to remember general information. You are familiar with tests that require learners to remember information. Such remember tests are a primary way to assess student learning. However, ask fails to assess a learner's ability to recognize a new portrayal, to perform a new task, or to solve a new problem. The interaction mode do requires the learner to apply the general information to a specific object or situation. The interaction mode do enables us to assess a learner's ability to recognize a new portrayal, perform a new task, or solve a new problem. Chapter 4 of my book, First Principles of Instruction, elaborates and illustrates these four primary interaction modes, plus a number of secondary types of learner interaction. When instructional interactions are combined with instructional content, they form instructional events. An instructional event is a learner interaction combined with a content element. For example, I might want to present information about a President of the United States. If I was discussing George Washington, an information element might be his term of office from 1789 through 1797. If I tell a learner his term of office, this is a tell information instructional event. Each type of component skill is taught with a unique set of instructional events comprised of tell information elements, show portrayal, ask information elements, or do portrayal elements by having learners recognize a new portrayal, do a step, predict a consequence, or find a faulted condition. First Principles of Instruction Design Theory describes a combination of instructional events appropriate for each type of component skill. The cells in this chart, as they appear in the textbook, identify the appropriate content elements for each type of instruction interaction for each type of component skill. Chapter 5 in my book, The First Principles of Instruction, describes and illustrates these prescribed instructional events and instructional strategies for each type of component skill. Strategy propositions can be combined to form a model for promoting problem solving. A primary component of problem solving is a set of conditions that, when true, lead to a desired consequence or problem solution. This what happens component skill requires learners to predict the consequence from a set of conditions, or to find faulted or missing conditions when there is an unanticipated consequence. In order to identify conditions that lead to a problem solution, learners must be able to determine if the condition shares all of the necessary properties required to lead to the consequence. This kind of component skill is prerequisite to being able to identify the conditions in a problem-solving situation. When conditions are not adequate or missing, then it is necessary for learners to execute steps that modify inadequate conditions or supply the missing conditions required for the consequence or problem solution. This how-to component skill is the third component of a problem-solving strategy. However, learners cannot execute appropriate steps until they are able to recognize those properties that characterize an adequate execution of the step such that it produces the desired condition. This is another kind of prerequisite for a model of problem solving. A model of problem solving requires an integrated combination of at least three different component skills: what happens, how to, and kind of. Some conditions also require prerequisite information about or part of component skills. The demonstration and application required to acquire a problem-solving skill therefore involves the prescriptive strategies for each of the component skills involved in problem solving. Chapter 6 of my book, First Principles of Instruction, elaborates and illustrates this integrated problem-solving model of instruction. Finally, problem-solving models for a progression of increasingly complex problem portrayals can be combined into a model for problem-centered cores. The next slide will describe this problem-centered model for teaching problem solving. Having described a problem-solving event, presented some information about a problem-solving event, let me now try to illustrate what a problem-solving event means. This is a very short clip from a course on selling furniture. Let me first show the clip, and then we'll explain a little bit of what we've just seen.
To begin, let's watch how David approaches Maria. Hi, how are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Oh, great. How do you like all this sunshine we're having?
Well, it's a nice change.
Well,
This was a very short clip, just one little greeting, but notice what's involved. In the rows here, I've indicated three different kinds of component skills: kind of, how to, what happens, and some more kind of. The kind of are the defining properties of the step. These properties are: he should treat her like a friend, he has a warm smile and a simple greeting. It takes longer to tell what's involved than it is to actually show it. But as you notice that he just said, "Hi, how are you today?" as indicated over on the right. The step is actually doing this, and he said in conducting this step there's some more information here. It says, think of greeting the customer in the same way you would a friend coming to your home. Share a warm, sincere smile, a simple greeting, etc., as it explains here. And so this is how to do this step. And then finally, what happens is what happens to the customer. And the defining properties here are, it says research as well as our own experience tells us that a first impression is the most lasting one. A warm and friendly greeting sets people at ease and makes them feel comfortable. So now if we observe Maria in this case, she says, well, fine, thank you, and has a big smile on her face. So it looks like that this warm greeting has accomplished its purpose of creating a condition for the customer to be at ease. All of these three things together, these three component skills, are all involved in this very simple greeting that David gives to Maria. We are all familiar with a typical topic-centered instructional strategy. In this kind of a strategy, topics are presented one by one. Along the way, there's a presentation and maybe some practice or test along the way with each topic. Finally, after all of the topics have been presented, there is usually a major project or final activity at the end, which kind of brings everything together. A problem-centered strategy is quite different from our typical topic-centered strategy. In this strategy, we first show a whole new problem. This needs to be a simplified problem, probably at first, but a problem that involves all that we want the student to learn how to do, and we show them that problem in a demonstration mode. The next thing we do is to tell them about the component skills which are involved in that problem. Finally, or third, we show them how these component skills are actually applied in the problem. So we tell them the component skills, introduce them to them, information, and then illustrate the portrayal of these component skills in the problem itself. Then we present another whole new problem to the student in a progression, and in this problem we ask the students to apply those skills which they have already learned to this problem. So now they were presented these skills and demonstrated with problem 1, and in problem 2 they actually do the skills and try to apply them to problem 2. There are probably additional elements to these component skills, or maybe even new skills required for problem 2, and so we now introduce by telling these new skills, and we then show them how these skills are applied, or the portrayal of these skills in the second problem. We repeat this process with a third problem and a fourth problem, etc., introducing new skills or elaborations of the skills they've already learned, teaching them the skills in one problem, having them apply it in the next problem, until we've taught them all of the component skills. And then finally, learners are able to complete a new problem on their own without assistance. This slide is an example of a problem-centered instructional strategy. This is based on a course on entrepreneurship designed for students from developing countries who were attending Brigham Young University, Hawaii. The idea here was that we would teach these students how to start a small business by introducing them to a progression of businesses. The names across the top indicate the businesses which were involved in this short course. The first one was how to begin a big pig farm. This was in Cambodia. The second one was how to start a carpet cleaning business in Mongolia. The third one was how a student started a cell phone business in Laie, Hawaii. And the fourth business was how to start a Mexican restaurant in Russia. The idea was that we would use these as a progression of whole problems. And so down the left-hand side are the component skills involved in each of these businesses. The first is to identify an opportunity, to develop an idea, to identify resources, to acquire those resources, to start the business, manage the business. Obviously, these are relatively complex component skills which have a lot of subparts, but these were taught as we went along. If we look at the first row in this table under identify an opportunity, we can see here by these symbols, and I will explain these, that in the first business on the pig farm, we told some of the component skills involved in identifying an opportunity, and we showed an example of these skills as they applied to the pig farm. For the second business, when they got to that business, the student had the opportunity to identify whether or not the business opportunity identified by these students for this carpet cleaning business met the criteria for an appropriate business opportunity. When they got to the third business, there was more to be taught. Before that, they were just concentrating on identifying whether the opportunity was well stated, whether it was a good opportunity. By the third business, we introduced the steps to create this condition, to create the business opportunity. And so there were a series of steps told about how students might go about finding an opportunity, investigating whether it was a good opportunity. So we introduced those sub-steps, and we also showed how these sub-steps were used by Devin when he created his cell phone business. Finally, in the fourth business, the students were asked to identify whether these students in designing this business for Russia actually executed the steps appropriately. So they recognized whether the steps were appropriate. They also recognized whether the business opportunity that they identified and put in their business plan was an adequate business opportunity. And finally, in the fifth business, they were to start their own business. They had to apply these steps in order to identify the business opportunity. As you can see, the instructional events that took place were distributed across the businesses. Now, when this curriculum was actually taught, we actually went through each whole business for all of the component skills. So we taught all of the component skills related to the pig farm, and then we came back and retaught or revisited those component skills for the carpet cleaning business and so forth across each of the businesses. So in each of those rows, the instructional events would basically go demonstrate and apply, and the application would have two levels: recognize when these steps were done correctly and recognize the conditions, and then finally execute the steps. And these instructional events were distributed across the businesses. So this is kind of an overview of this course that implements this problem-centered instructional strategy which we described. This course is available online for you to look at. I can provide the URL to those who may be interested if they would like to go look at this course. In the first part of this lecture, I have described the instructional design theory underlying first principles of instruction. We introduced the notion that we needed terms to describe content, terms to describe interaction, that when we combined content and interaction, we produced instructional strategies. We have identified in first principles 5 major principles. One of these principles is the demonstration principles, which says learning is promoted when learners observe a demonstration of the skills to be learned. When we introduce the strategies, we indicate what kind of demonstration is appropriate for each of the 5 kinds of content which are identified in the theory. We also identified that type of application, those instructional events which are appropriate for application for each of the 5 kinds of instructional events. So this is the second principle, that learning is promoted when learners engage in an application of their newly acquired knowledge or skill that is consistent with the type of content being taught. The third principle that we want to introduce here is the problem-centered principle, which we discussed at some length, that learning is promoted when learners are engaged in a problem-centered strategy involving a progression of whole real-world tasks.